What is a woman's life worth when weighed against the ledgers of desperate men? In the glittering, deceptive ballrooms of Mayfair, it is measured in the currency of pedigree and submission. But on the wild, jagged cliffs of the Cornish coast, survival demands a far fiercer toll. To escape a destiny behind iron bars, a lady must risk everything on a dangerous gamble, discovering that the only thing more perilous than a lawless man's secrets is the treacherous heat of his touch. If you find yourself lost in this tale of fire and truth, subscribe for the next chapter. Tell us in the comments, would you choose duty or desire? Chapter 1. The Blood-Red Veil. The scent of damp wool and old rot had a way of clinging to the lungs, a persistent reminder of how easily a life of privilege could dissolve into ruin. For 3 weeks, Lady Christabel had watched the rain streak the grime-caked windows of her father's London townhouse, each drop counting down the hours until the bailiffs arrived to drag what remained of her family to Fleet Prison. Her father, the Earl of Radcliffe, lay in the adjoining room, his breathing a rattling wheeze that shook his frail frame. "It is arranged, Christabel," he had whispered that morning, his grey skin reflecting the bleak London light. His hand, cold and trembling, had pressed a heavy wax-sealed parchment into her palm. A proxy marriage. Lord Devlin Thorne. He is a reclusive peer with an estate in Cornwall, isolated enough to keep you far from the reach of my creditors. I have traded your hand for your sanctuary. You must leave tonight. Propriety demanded she weep, or perhaps offer a meek nod of filial obedience. Instead, Christabel had merely tightened her jaw, feeling the suffocating constraints of her corset pinch her ribs like iron bands. She felt no grief, only a hollow, aching resolve. She would not rot in a debtor's cell. If she must bind her life to a phantom lord hidden away on the edge of the earth, she would do so with her countenance held high. The carriage journey to the coastal edges of Cornwall took a brutal fortnight, the roads dissolving into mires of black mud as the carriage rattled further away from civilization. When the driver finally pulled the horses to a halt, Christabel stepped out into a howling gale that tasted sharply of salt and ancient stone. Before her stood Blackwood Manor. It was less a home and more a fortress, perched precariously on the lip of a sheer cliff that plunged into the churning, foam-flecked Atlantic below. The stone was blackened by centuries of sea spray, the windows dark and unwelcoming. There were no liveried footmen to greet her, no warmth radiating from the heavy oak doors. Bracing herself against the wind, her blood-red travelling veil whipping violently around her face, Christabel entered the grand hall. The air inside smelled of burning peat, old timber, and expensive amber brandy. "You are late, my lady." The voice vibrated through the shadows of the high-arched room, deep and gravelly, carrying the unmistakable cadence of command. Christabel stiffened, her eyes adjusting to the dim candlelight. She had expected a frail, cloistered aristocrat, a man broken by age or illness, hiding from the world. Instead, the man who stepped into the firelight was broad-shouldered and dangerously vital. He wore no powdered wig, no tailored velvet coat of a London gentleman. His dark linen shirt was unbuttoned at the throat, exposing skin bronzed by a sun that did not belong to England. A silver-white scar cut sharply through his left eyebrow, drawing attention to eyes the colour of a stormy sea, sharp, calculating, and entirely devoid of aristocratic softness. "Lord Thorne, I presume?" Christabel said, her voice remarkably steady despite the sudden, erratic thudding of her heart. The man tilted his glass of brandy toward her, his lips curving into a slow, mocking smile. "Thorne will do. Your journey was uneventful, I trust?" "If one discounts the mud, the rain, and the distinct impression that I was being banished to the ends of the earth, it was thoroughly delightful," she replied, her Austen-honed wit shielding her from the sheer, imposing weight of his presence. Devlin Thorne walked toward her, his movements possessing the fluid, lethal grace of a predator. As he closed the distance, the scent of sea salt and pure danger enveloped her. He reached out, his large, calloused fingers catching the edge of her red veil, brushing against her jawline. The brief contact sparked an electric tremor that shot straight down her spine. He flipped the lace back, his intense gaze raking over her pale face, her dark hair damp from the storm, and the defiant fire burning in her eyes. "You have a sharp tongue, Lady Christabel. Let us hope you possess the stomach to match it." By midnight, the storm outside had reached a crescendo, rattling the leaded windows of the master bedchamber. The proxy ceremony had been a cold, perfunctory affair conducted by a trembling local curate, but the reality of her situation settled over Christabel like a heavy shroud as she sat on the edge of the massive four-poster bed. Devlin had left her hours ago, claiming he had matters to attend to on the cliffs. Suspicion, sharp and persistent, gnawed at her. There was nothing about this man that spoke of the peerage. His hands were rough with the scars of hard labour, his bearing too fierce, his manor house entirely devoid of the standard trappings of nobility. Determined to find answers, Christabel stood, the heavy silk of her wedding gown rustling in the quiet room. She began to search the shadows. In the corner of the chamber, half hidden beneath a heavy velvet drape, sat an anomaly, a massive, iron-bound sea chest. Her breath hitched. She knelt before it, her fingers tracing the heavy padlock. Ripping a long, sturdy wire pin from her elaborate hairstyle, she inserted it into the mechanism. Her father had taught her many things before his ruin, including the fact that locks were merely suggestions for the desperate. With a satisfying click, the iron latch gave way. Christabel lifted the heavy lid. Inside lay no family heirlooms or legal deeds of land. Instead, her hands brushed against heavy nautical charts, logbooks bearing the name of a notorious vessel called the Marauder, and a stack of foreign gold pieces. At the very bottom, wrapped in oilskin, lay a fragmented piece of ancient parchment. She unrolled it beneath the flickering candlelight. It was a map, intricately drawn, detailing the hidden coves of the Cornish coast and leading to a marked coordinate labelled Plata de la Sangre, Spanish treasure. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her husband was no lord. Devlin Thorne was a legendary former privateer, a lawless rogue using a dead man's title to hide from the crown while he pieced together a stolen fortune. She had traded a debtor's prison for a pirate's den. "I will not be a captive to another man's sins," she whispered to the empty room. Panic warped into a cold, fiercely brilliant resolve. If she kept this secret, she was complicit in treason. But if she took the map, she held the ultimate leverage. She could sell it to the highest bidder in London and buy her absolute, unconditional independence. Moving with frantic efficiency, Christabel tucked the rough parchment deep inside the stays of her corset, the cold ink pressing hard against her skin. She looked down at her wedding gown. The long, cumbersome train of ivory silk would destroy any hope of escape. Glancing around, she spotted Devlin's heavy hunting dagger resting on the bureau. Grasping the hilt, she gathered the heavy skirts of her gown and, with a fierce yank, sliced the fabric clean at her knees. Leaving the ruined silk scattered on the floor like discarded petals, she threw a heavy wool cloak over her shoulders, pulled the hood tight, and slipped out of the side door into the teeth of the roaring storm. The rain lashed at her face, but as she fled into the enveloping darkness of the Cornish night, Christabel felt something she hadn't felt in years. Entirely, magnificently free. Chapter 2. The Highway of Shadows. The grey dawn did not break over the Cornish cliffs so much as it bled through the mist, cold and unvouchsafing. In the master bedchamber of Blackwood Manor, Devlin Thorne stood before his open sea chest. The iron padlock hung uselessly, its internal mechanisms deftly picked with a precision that spoke of a very different kind of education than the one usually afforded an earl's daughter. On the floor lay the discarded remnants of ivory silk, the skirt of her wedding gown, sheared off at the knees with his own hunting dagger. A slow, dangerous smile curved Devlin's lips, though his sea-storm eyes remained entirely devoid of warmth. The clever little witch. He had expected a fragile, weeping hothouse lily, a sacrificial lamb sent by a desperate father to pay a gambler's debts. Instead, he had married a creature of fire and steel. She hadn't just discovered his secret. She had stolen the one thing that anchored his future and fled into a tempest that would have terrified most grown men. "You should have run faster, Christabel," he murmured to the empty room, his voice a low, gravelly promise. He did not call for his servants. He did not summon a carriage. Devlin donned his heavy leather riding coat, strapped a brace of pistols to his chest, and went to the stables. Tracking her was not difficult. A lady travelling alone on foot in the dead of night leaves a distinct trail. even before she barters a diamond ring for a seat on a passing mail coach headed east toward Devon. He could smell her fear and her defiance on the wind. Like a wolf tracking a scent through the mire, he set his horse into a merciless gallop, the mud of the highway spraying behind him as he pursued his runaway bride. The rain in Devonshire fell in unrelenting sheets, turning the courtyard of the Black Boar Inn into a swamp of black filth. Inside the taproom, the air was thick with the choking stench of wet dogs, stale ale, and cheap tallow candles. Christabel sat in the farthest corner, tucked beneath the shadow of a sagging oak beam. Her knees, exposed beneath her ruined, dirt-caked gown, trembled with sheer exhaustion. Her hands tightly clutched a mug of lukewarm cider, less for the sustenance and more to thaw her frozen fingers. Beneath her stays, the oilskin-wrapped map pressed against her ribs, a heavy, comforting weight. She had made it across the county line. In the morning, another coach would take her to London, where independence awaited. The heavy oak door of the inn groaned open, admitting a blast of freezing wind and a man who seemed to swallow the very light in the room. Christabel froze. Devlin stood in the threshold, water dripping from the brim of his hat and the shoulders of his leather coat. His countenance was grim, his jaw set in a hard, unyielding line. He did not look around the room. His gaze locked onto her instantly, pulling her into his orbit with the force of an incoming tide. Before she could stand, before she could even draw breath to scream, he crossed the room with terrifying, silent efficiency. He slipped into the wooden bench directly opposite her, his massive frame trapping her against the wall. "A charming establishment, Lady Thorne," Devlin said, his voice terrifyingly polite, though his eyes burned with a lethal intensity, "but hardly fitting for a honeymoon." "I am not returning to Cornwall," Christabel whispered, her chin tilting upward despite the frantic hammering in her chest. "I know what you are. I know the title is a lie. And I know what you have in your corset, my sweet," he replied, leaning in so close she could smell the rain on his skin and the faint intoxicating scent of brandy. "If you scream, I will simply tell the landlord that my eccentric, mentally afflicted wife has escaped her keepers. They will lock you in a cellar. Choose your next words with care." The landlord, properly bribed and thoroughly intimidated by Devlin's imposing presence, claimed there was only a single cramped room available at the top of the stairs. Once the door was shut and bolted against the world, Christabel backed away until her spine hit the rough plaster wall. Devlin deliberately removed his damp coat, tossing it over a chair. Then, from his pocket, he drew a length of polished iron. It was a pair of heavy maritime manacles, the metal dull and unforgiving. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "You are a flight risk, Christabel," Devlin said calmly. He stepped forward, capturing her right wrist in a grip that was surprisingly gentle but entirely inescapable. With a sharp clack, the iron cuff locked around her delicate skin. He then fastened the opposing cuff to his own left wrist. A mere 8 inches of heavy iron links hung between them. "Now we share an understanding. Where I go, you go. If you move in the night, I move." The sheer, suffocating proximity of the man was overwhelming. The room contained but a single, narrow bed with a sagging feather mattress. As the candle flickered out, leaving the room illuminated only by the dying embers of the hearth, they lay down on the mattress, fully clothed. The iron chain rattled between them, a cold, metallic reminder of their bondage. Every breath Devlin took pulled at her wrist. Christabel lay perfectly still, her heart racing so violently she was certain he could hear it. He was too close. The heat radiating from his massive body was a scorching contrast to the chilled room, wrapping around her until she felt entirely consumed by him. "You hate me," she whispered into the darkness, her voice sounding small, stripped of her usual aristocratic armor. A low, rough rumble came from his chest. He shifted, pulling the chain taut, bringing their faces inches apart in the shadows. She could see the faint glint of his eyes, the hard line of his jaw. "Hate you," Devlin murmured, his thumb brushing against the inside of her bound wrist, right over her racing pulse. "Little witch, I have never met a woman who dared to steal from me and cut her wedding dress to pieces just to escape me. I don't hate you. I am utterly fascinated by you, and that makes you far more dangerous to me than any king's navy." Christabel swallowed hard, the hostility between them warping into something thick, heavy, and terrifyingly electric. Every tug of the iron link felt like a physical heartbeat passing between them, a dangerous confession written in the dark, binding the lady and the pirate closer than any vows ever could. Chapter 3. The Friction of Flesh and Steel. The road toward London was a grueling test of endurance, a grey ribbon of mire cutting through a bleak, unyielding landscape. Inside the cramped, rattling interior of the hired post-chaise, the iron manacles had been reluctantly replaced by a thick leather tether wrapped around their wrists, a concession Devlin made for the sake of speed, though it offered no less a reminder of who was captor and who was prize. For 2 days they traded barbs like seasoned duelists. Christabel deployed her sharpest societal wit to keep him at bay, mocking his lack of a proper coat of arms, while Devlin countered with a lazy, devastating amusement that left her entirely unsettled. Yet beneath the banter, the atmosphere inside the carriage grew heavy, thick, with an unspoken, volatile awareness. Near the Hampshire border, the fragile peace shattered. The carriage lurched violently to a halt, the horses screaming in panic. Through the rain-streaked window, Christabel caught the flash of a pistol's flintlock and the harsh shout of a demand. Highwaymen. 3 masked men on horseback had swarmed the post-chaise. Before she could even process the danger, Devlin moved. With a low growl, he yanked the leather tether, pulling Christabel down onto the floorboards of the carriage. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice stripped of all mockery, replaced by the lethal coldness of a captain on a boarding deck. He shielded her body with his own for a fraction of a second, his massive frame an impenetrable wall of muscle and leather. Then, slipping the tether from his wrist with practiced ease, he burst through the carriage door into the pelting rain. What followed was not the gentlemanly duel of a London park, but a display of visceral, terrifying efficiency. Christabel peered over the edge of the seat, her breath catching in her throat. Devlin dodged a clumsy cutlass swing, grabbed the rider's arm and dragged him fiercely from his saddle, throwing him into the mud. A pistol shot rang out, blindingly bright in the grey afternoon, and another attacker collapsed with a heavy groan. Devlin did not hesitate. He moved like the storm itself, brutal, precise, and entirely unyielding. Within minutes, the remaining highwayman fled into the tree line, leaving his companions defeated in the dirt. When the carriage door flung open again, Christabel braced herself. Devlin stood in the frame, his chest heaving, rain plastering his dark hair to his forehead. His knuckles were raw and bleeding, yet his stormy eyes swept over her with frantic, wild urgency. "Are you harmed?" he demanded, his hands catching her shoulders, scanning her face for any sign of injury. "I am intact," she breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at his bleeding hand, then up into his fierce, possessive gaze. For the first time, the veneer of the lawless criminal cracked. He had not hidden behind her, nor had he used her as a shield. He had fought for her with a fierce, protective chivalry that shattered her assumptions to their very foundations. He was a dangerous man, yes, but he was no mere thief. By nightfall, the heavens opened in a violent, howling deluge that rendered the roads impassable. The post-chaise's axle groaned and snapped a mile from the nearest village, forcing them to seek shelter in a towering, abandoned stone tithe barn nestled at the edge of a forgotten wood. Inside, the air smelled of dry dust, ancient timber, and the sharp electric scent of ozone from the lightning striking outside. Thunder rattled the heavy oak rafters, shaking dust into the shadows. Christabel stood shivering in the centre of the barn, her wet cloak pooling water around her boots. She was soaked to the bone, her teeth chattering uncontrollably as the cold seeped deep into her marrow. Devlin closed the massive barn doors, shutting out the worst of the gale. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim, shadowed twilight. Without a word, he shed his heavy leather coat, dropping it to the straw. Then his fingers moved to the buttons of his linen shirt. Christabel stepped back, her breath hitching. "What are you doing?" "Saving you from inflammation of the lungs, little witch," he said gruffly. He pulled the dry, white linen shirt over his head, exposing a torso that stole the remaining air from her lungs. His chest was broad, heavily muscled, and mapping a history of violence, marred by pale sword cuts and the jagged mark of a musket ball near his ribs. He didn't advance on her like a predator. Instead, He stepped close and began to gently wrap the dry, soft linen of his shirt around her rain-soaked hair. The proximity was scorching. The heat radiating from his bare skin was a physical force, combating the freezing dampness of the barn. Christabel went entirely still as his large calloused hands worked with surprising, agonizing tenderness, pressing the fabric against her scalp, drying the tangled silk of her dark curls. "Why did you marry me, Devlin?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper against the roll of thunder outside. "It wasn't for the Earl's title. You already had that by deception, and it wasn't for money my father didn't have." Devlin's hands paused. He looked down at her, his stormy gaze softening into something raw and deeply shadowed. He let the shirt drop around her shoulders, his thumbs tracing the delicate line of her collarbone. "Your father saved my life years ago, when the Crown's privateers were hunted like dogs," Devlin confessed, his voice low, vibrating through the small space between them. "He sent a letter to Cornwall weeks ago. He told me he was dying, that his creditors would ruin you, and that you would be left to rot in the fleet. He asked for a blood vow. He asked me to protect you." Christabel's eyes widened, a profound ache blooming in her chest. "A vow? I didn't marry you for convenience, Christabel. I did it because I swore an oath to keep you safe from the world." His gaze darkened, his thumb brushing her lower lip, which trembled from more than just the cold. "What I didn't expect was that the woman I swore to protect would be a fierce, brilliant creature who would steal my heart along with my map." The last remaining masks slipped away, leaving them entirely bare in the shadows of the barn. The tension that had been building between them since that first stormy night on the Cornish cliffs finally snapped. Christabel reached up, her fingers burying themselves in the damp hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him down. Their first kiss was explosive. It tasted of rain, stolen secrets, and a desperate, aching hunger that neither could deny any longer. Devlin groaned, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her against his bare chest until she was enveloped entirely by his heat. His mouth was possessive, demanding yet deeply reverent, claiming her with a passion that made her forget the constraints of her past, her duty, and the very world outside. In the dark, shivering barn, surrounded by the fury of the storm, the lady and the privateer found a scorching, inescapable truth in each other's arms. Chapter 4: The Twist, the Captain's Resurrection. The sulphurous yellow underbelly of the London fog swallowed the outskirts of the city, transforming the familiar landscape into a graveyard of shifting silhouettes. The air no longer tasted of clean Cornish salt or the wild Hampshire rain. It was thick with soot, river rot, and the oppressive weight of civilization. Yet inside the post-chaise, the atmosphere remained intensely personal. The leather tether was gone, but an invisible, far more unyielding bond had taken its place. Christabel sat close to Devlin, the warmth of his shoulder pressing against hers, a silent anchor amidst the encroaching gloom. "We are nearly there," Devlin murmured, his gaze fixed on the opaque world outside the carriage window. His hand rested on her thigh, his thumb tracing slow, comforting circles through the heavy wool of her cloak. "A safe house near the docks. Once the map is secured in a location of my choosing, we will settle the matter of your independence. Or," he paused, his stormy eyes locking onto hers with a raw, predatory tenderness, "we will renegotiate the terms of our marriage entirely." Christabel felt a tremor of anticipation ripple through her, a stark contrast to the dread that usually accompanied her approach to London. "And if I choose to hold you to your vow, Captain Thorne?" Before he could answer, the carriage violently shuddered. The sound of splintering wood tore through the fog, followed by the agonizing shriek of the horses as the carriage was forced off the road, tilting precariously before crashing against the stone perimeter of a ruined medieval abbey. The impact hurled Christabel across the compartment. Devlin caught her instantly, shielding her head with his arm as the glass windows shattered inward in a deadly shower of shards. "Stay behind me!" Devlin roared, his voice stripping away the last vestiges of the reclusive lord. The carriage door was ripped open from the outside. Through the veil of dust and sea-coal smoke, a dozen men swarmed the wreckage. These were no desperate highwaymen seeking a handful of sovereigns. They moved with the ruthless, synchronized precision of a boarding party. They wore salt-stained leather, grease-blackened canvas, and carried heavy naval cutlasses that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. Devlin burst from the ruined carriage like a demon unchained. His cutlass caught the first man across the throat, a visceral spray of crimson darkening the fog. He fired his pistol into the chest of a second, the thunderous report echoing off the crumbling, vine-choked stone arches of the ancient abbey. But the numbers were overwhelming. For every man Devlin cut down, two more took his place, dragging him by his arms, his legs, pinning his massive frame to the earth through sheer, brutal mass. "Devlin!" Christabel screamed, scrambling from the wreckage, her knees scraping against the jagged gravel. She reached for the fallen dagger in the dirt, but a heavy, mud-caked boot stomped down on her wrist, pinning her to the ground. "Hold your fire, lads," a voice called out from the mist. "We wouldn't want to damage the merchandise before the accounting is done." The voice was deep, resonant, and entirely free of the rattling wheeze that had haunted Christabel's nightmares for the past month. The fog parted slowly, like a curtain rising on a grotesque theatre. A man stepped into the courtyard of the ruined abbey. He wore an elegant, gold-trimmed captain's coat of deep sapphire wool, a polished, brass-hilted sabre hanging easily at his hip. His skin was not grey, it was ruddy and tanned by a Caribbean sun. His shoulders were squared, his posture commanding. Christabel felt the breath completely leave her body, the cold mud beneath her face forgotten as the world tilted violently on its axis. "Father?" she whispered, the word tasting like ash on her tongue. The Earl of Radcliffe, the dying, debt-ridden old man she had wept over, the father for whom she had sacrificed her reputation, her freedom, and her very body to save from a debtor's cell, looked down at her with a cool appraisal that contained not a shred of paternal affection. "You look dreadful, Christabel," he said, adjusting the lace at his cuffs with a careless flick of his wrist, "though I suppose a fortnight in a common post-chaise would do that to any lady of breeding." You are alive," she breathed, her heart fracturing with a sickening hollow ache. "The bailiffs, the fleet, the sickness." "A necessary fiction, my dear," the Earl replied, a slow, mocking smile touching his lips. He turned his gaze toward Devlin, who was pinned to the earth by 4 brawny sailors, his face bloodied but his eyes burning with a terrifying, lethal rage. "The great Captain Thorne, the cleverest privateer to ever sail the Atlantic. Tell me, Devlin, did you truly think a decrepit old nobleman could outwit you? No, I knew your weaknesses far too well." Devlin spat blood into the dirt, his muscles straining against the men holding him down until the leather of his coat groaned. "Radcliffe, you treacherous bastard!" "Treacherous? No, merely pragmatic," the Earl countered, stepping closer, his boots clicking rhythmically against the stone. "You were too cautious, Devlin. For 3 years I hunted for the fragments of the Plata de la Sangre map. I knew you had them, but you were a ghost. You lived behind a dead man's title, surrounded by fortresses and loyal men. If I brought my crew to Cornwall, you would have blown us out of the water before we hit the shallows. You would never open your gates for a rival captain." He paused, looking down at Christabel, his expression hardening into something purely predatory. "But you would open them for a blood vow. You would open them for the daughter of the man who once pulled you from a Spanish gallows." The Earl chuckled, a dark, vibrating sound that made Christabel's stomach turn with physical nausea. "I faked my illness. I invented the debts. I knew your ridiculous, archaic sense of honor would compel you to marry her to protect her. She was the perfect, beautiful piece of bait. I sent her into your parlor to find what I could never reach." The truth hit Christabel with the crushing force of an avalanche. She had not been saved by a father's dying wish. She had been used as a disposable pawn, a tracking hound sent to sniff out a treasure. "She knew nothing, Radcliffe," Devlin growled, his voice a low, vibrating promise of death. "She is innocent in this." "Oh, I know she knew nothing," the Earl said smoothly, leaning down to rip the heavy wool cloak from Christabel's shoulders. His rough hands searched her, tearing at the silk of her bodice until his fingers caught the oilskin packet tucked tightly within her stays. He pulled it free, unrolling the ancient parchment with a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "But she did exactly what she was bred to do. She brought the map out into the open. She brought you out into the open." He stepped back, holding the map up to the dim London light, completely ignoring the silent, devastating tears that finally spilled over Christabel's cheeks. She did not weep for her freedom, or even for her life. She wept for the profound, suffocating realization that the only man who had ever truly tried to protect her was the lawless pirate currently bleeding in the dirt beside her. Chapter 5. The True Anchor. The cold weight of the mud against Christabel's cheek was nothing compared to the freezing clarity that washed over her soul. The tears that had risen from a wounded daughter's heart dried instantly, replaced by a searing, venomous resolve. She looked at the Earl of Radcliffe, her biological sire, and saw him for exactly what he was, a hollow blackguard masquerading in sapphire wool. Slowly, deliberately, Christabel pushed herself up from the dirt. She smoothed the torn, dirt-caked silk of her bodice, lifting her chin with the haughty elegance of a duchess navigating a ballroom, despite the ruins of the abbey surrounding her. She did not look at the pistol levelled at her breast. Instead, she turned her gaze toward the bristling crew of mercenaries. "A magnificent haul, gentlemen," Christabel said, her voice dripping with razor-sharp, aristocratic disdain. "You have helped a grand earl steal a piece of paper, but tell me, has my father mentioned how he intends to divide the Plata della Sangre among 12 men? The earl's countenance darkened. "Silence the girl. He told you it was a simple matter of digging, did he not?" Christabel continued, stepping closer to the men, her eyes flashing with Austenesque brilliance as she exploited their base avarice. "He failed to mention that the coordinates require a royal naval cipher to decode, one that only Captain Thorne possesses in his mind. A man who would use his own daughter as disposable bait will surely share his wealth with common cutthroats? I think not. The moment you step aboard a ship, he will have you all hanged for piracy to keep the entirety for himself." A murmuring ripple of doubt broke through the ranks. The sailors shifted their weight, their loyalty wavering under the weight of her words. That single breathless moment of hesitation was all Devlin needed. With a primal, earth-shaking roar, Devlin violently wrenched his shoulders forward. The men holding him, distracted by Christabel's performance, lost their purchase. Devlin delivered a brutal, sweeping kick that shattered the knee of the closest sailor, seized a fallen cutlass from the mud, and rose like a vengeful sea god. The duel that followed was visceral, bloody, and entirely lacking in gentlemanly decorum. Devlin moved through the fog like a hurricane, the ring of steel against steel echoing off the ancient stone arches. He fought with a lethal, possessive fury, his gaze locking onto Christabel between every swing, ensuring no hand dared to touch her again. In the chaotic melee, a fleeing sailor kicked a shattered oil lantern into a pile of dry winter straw. Flames erupted instantly, licking hungrily up the timber scaffolding of the ruined abbey. The Earl of Radcliffe panicked. As the fire caught the dry canvas of the carriage, a sudden violent gust of wind from the broken roof ripped the ancient parchment right from his hands. "No!" the Earl shrieked, his refined veneer completely dissolving into madness as he lunged toward the blaze. The oilskin packet caught a stray spark. In a matter of seconds, the map that had cost so many lives disintegrated into a flurry of bright, glowing embers, swept upward into the dark London night. Realizing his prize was lost and his crew was scattering into the fog, the Earl cast one final, terrified look at the bloodied, advancing figure of Devlin Thorne before fleeing blindly into the shadows of the city, broken, destitute, and condemned to a permanent, cowardly exile. Devlin did not give the fleeing Earl a second thought. He didn't even look at the ashes of the treasure map. The cutlass clattered from his hand as he collapsed to his knees, a deep crimson stain spreading across the left side of his linen shirt where a blade had found his ribs. His breathing was a ragged, painful wheeze, but his stormy eyes were fixed entirely on his bride. He began to crawl through the black smoke toward her. "Christabel." His voice was a rough, broken growl. Stripped of all strength except for the sheer desperation to reach her, she dropped to the earth beside him, her hands flying to his chest, her fingers desperate to stem the flow of blood. "Hush, Devlin, do not move. The map, the gold, it is all gone. I am so sorry." Devlin reached up, his large, calloused hands smeared with soot and his own blood, gently cupping her jawline. A slow, breathless smile touched his lips. "Let it burn, little witch," he murmured. pulling her down until her forehead rested against his. The gold was just metal. The map was just paper. I have my anchor right here. The treasure had never been buried in a Spanish chest. The true fortune was the fierce, unyielding trust that had been forged in the mud of Devon, tested by the highwaymen of Hampshire, and sealed in the blood of the London fog. They were two outcasts, bound by an iron link that had warped into something far stronger than any law of the realm. 3 weeks later, the Atlantic gale blew clean and sweet over the jagged cliffs of Cornwall. The black stones of Blackwood Manor were bathed in the pale, brilliant light of a winter morning. Devlin stood at the edge of the sheer precipice, his injuries healing, though a new scar had joined the map of his torso. In his hand he held the heavy, iron manacles that had once bound them together in the dark room of the Black Boar Inn. With a powerful swing of his arm, he hurled the iron into the sky. It caught the light before plunging silently into the churning white foam of the sea far below. He turned to Christabel, who stood a few paces behind him. She wore no corset today, no suffocating velvet or heavy silk. Her dark hair blew wildly in the salt wind, and her eyes were brighter than the sea. "You are entirely free, Lady Christabel," Devlin said, his voice carrying the deep, steady rhythm of the tide. "There are no debts to your name. Your father is gone. There are no chains and no vows of duty left to bind you. A carriage is waiting in the courtyard if you wish to return to London." Christabel looked at the empty horizon, then walked slowly toward him. She closed the distance between them, stepping inside the circle of his warmth, and placed her small hands against the broad expanse of his chest. "London is a city of ghosts and ledger books, Captain Thorne," she whispered, her lips curving into a soft, wicked smile, "and I have grown quite fond of living with a pirate." As Devlin's powerful arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her fiercely against him, Christabel leaned back into his embrace. The wind howled around them, wild and untamed, but within the circle of his touch, she knew she had found the only true sanctuary she would ever need. For what is freedom, if not the choice to bind oneself to the storm? In the wreck of their pasts, they had lost titles, fortunes, and names. Yet as they stood on the edge of the world, they held a truth that no king could conquer, and no sea could wash away. If this journey of shadows, steel, and scorching passion has captured your heart, subscribe to ensure you never miss our next romance. Tell us in the comments below, did Christabel make the right choice to leave her past in the ashes?